Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris, great to be back. And honestly, today is one of those rare episodes where the news is going to make hardware engineers, researchers, and venture investors equally interested.
That's quite a tease right out of the gate, Laura, so go ahead and tell our listeners what we are unpacking today and why it has so many corners of the industry buzzing this week.
Today, we are diving into Zyphra's release of ZAYA1-8B, a reasoning mixture of experts model that quietly dropped earlier this week and is punching way above its weight class.
Okay, the model name alone deserves some unpacking here because most of our listeners hear 8B in a model name and assume small toy model, but you are saying this is anything but.
Exactly. And that is the first counterintuitive thing about it because ZAYA1 has 8.4 billion total parameters, but only 760 million active per token at inference time.
So this is a sparse mixture of experts architecture where only a fraction of the network actually fires on any given query, which is a design pattern we have seen before from labs like Mistral and DeepSeek.
Right, but the real headline is what those 760 million active parameters can actually accomplish. Because on competition mathematics, this model is genuinely pacing leading frontier reasoning systems.
Let's hold the benchmark conversation for a few minutes, because I want to start with the part that actually surprised me most when I read through the technical report Zyphra published.
Let me guess, you're about to bring up the hardware story, because that is the angle everyone in the chip world is suddenly paying very close attention to right now in 2026.
Bingo, this model was pre-trained entirely on AMD Instinct MI300X GPUs on a dedicated cluster of 1,024 chips, which is a meaningful break from the NVIDIA monoculture.
And the networking stack is also AMD, specifically the Pensando Payara interconnect, all sitting on top of IBM cloud infrastructure. So this is essentially a full alternative training stack from chips to cluster fabric.
For listeners who do not live and breathe data center hardware all day, can you put into context why training a frontier reasoning model on AMD silicon is genuinely a big deal in 2026?
Sure, for the last several years, almost every serious frontier training run has happened on NVIDIA chips with the CUDA software stack. And that monoculture has shaped pricing, supply chains, and even research direction.
So when a company demonstrates that you can take AMD hardware end-to-end and still train a model that competes with the best open-weight reasoning systems, that is a major market signal everyone notices.
It is a huge signal because it tells hyperscalers, sovereign AI projects, and even nation-states that they have a real second source for AI compute, which immediately changes their negotiating leverage on contracts.
And from AMD's perspective, this is exactly the kind of credibility moment they have been chasing for years. Because you can sell all the chips you want, but you still need the public proof points.
Exactly, and what Zyphra essentially gave AMD is a public, reproducible, open-weight artifact that says, yes, you can do real frontier reasoning model pre-training on this stack at production scale today.
One number that jumped out at me from the technical report is that this cluster delivered over 750 petaflops of max achievable training performance, which is genuinely production scale by any reasonable standard.
And they trained ZAYA1 base on 14 trillion tokens, using a three-phase curriculum that shifted from broad web data into denser math, coding, and reasoning material as the run progressed through training.
That curriculum strategy is increasingly the playbook for reasoning models because you want the model to first absorb the breadth of human language and then sharpen its formal thinking on more structured data.
Right, and one technical detail many listeners will appreciate is that they use the muon optimizer rather than AtomW, which is part of a broader trend of labs squeezing more out of every training token they spend.
All right, let's pivot to the architecture itself, because Zyphra did not just stand up an existing transformer recipe on different chips. They introduced several genuinely novel ideas they collectively call MoE++.
There are three things I want to highlight, and the first one is compressed convolutional attention, which they abbreviate as CCA, and which I think is one of the more elegant attention ideas this year.
Translate that for our listeners who do not write attention kernels for fun on their weekends. What does compressed convolutional attention actually do that standard multi-head attention does not already do?
At a high level, attention has this expensive memory structure called the KV cache that grows with context length, and CCA uses convolutional compression to shrink that cache by roughly 8 times.
So that means longer contexts at lower memory cost, which directly translates into either bigger context windows on the same hardware or much cheaper inference for the same context length on the same hardware.
Precisely. And importantly, they claim this compression happens with negligible accuracy loss, which is the holy grail of efficiency work, because most compression schemes have some kind of quality tax hiding somewhere in the system.
The second innovation you mentioned was the router, which is the piece of a mixture of experts model that decides which experts to consult for each token coming through the network during inference.
Right. And instead of the standard linear router that most MoE systems use, Zyphra built a small MLP-based router, which they say improves routing stability during both pre-training and inference.
Routing stability matters because if your router is jittery, you waste compute on unstable expert assignments. And you can also see strange degradation patterns across long training runs that are hard to debug after the fact.
Exactly. And the third architectural piece is something called learned residual scaling, which controls how the residual stream norm grows as you go deeper into the network during the pre-training process.
That sounds esoteric, but I know from experience that residual norm explosions are one of the silent killers of large training runs. So taming that with cheap learned scalars is a really practical engineering win.
It is, and the punchline of all three of these innovations is that they cost almost nothing in extra parameters or floating point operations, but they meaningfully improve quality, stability, and efficiency together.
Now let's move to what I think is the most genuinely novel piece of this whole release, which is their test time compute methodology that the Zyphra team is calling Markovian RSA.
This one is genuinely fun because it combines two ideas that have been floating around in the research community separately, and Zyphra essentially fused them into a practical recipe that demonstrably works in production.
Walk us through the two parent ideas first, because I think that helps frame why the combination is more than the sum of its parts when you actually run it on hard reasoning problems.
The first idea is recursive self-aggregation, where you generate multiple parallel reasoning traces for a given problem and then have the model reconcile them into a better unified answer at the end.
That is essentially a structured form of best-of-n sampling, but instead of picking one winner, you ask the model to synthesize across the candidates, which often beats simple voting or scoring approaches.
Exactly. And the second parent idea is Markovian thinking, where you do reasoning in fixed-length chunks and only carry forward a small tail from the previous chunk into the next chunk in the sequence.
Which means your effective context window stays constant, even though the model can keep reasoning for a very long time, which is critical for hard problems that need extended deliberation across many tokens.
Right, so Markovian RSA combines those by generating parallel traces, then taking only the tails of each trace, typically a 4,000 token budget, and feeding those into a single aggregation prompt.
So you get the breadth of parallel exploration plus the unbounded depth of Markovian chunking, all while keeping memory constant, which is genuinely a clever piece of inference engineering for reasoning models.
And the practical result on hard math benchmarks is that ZAYA1 with Markovian RSA approaches or beats frontier closed models, which is wild for an open model with under 1 billion active parameters.
Speaking of benchmarks, let's get specific because vague claims about frontier performance are a dime a dozen in this industry, and our listeners deserve concrete numbers wherever we can give them on this show.
On AIME and HMMT, two of the toughest competition mathematics benchmarks, ZAYA1 matches DeepSeek R1, which is a model many times its size and a recognized published reasoning leader.
And under extended Markovian RSA test time compute, they reported approaching or beating Claude 4.5 Sonnet, Gemini 2.5 Pro, and DeepSeek v3.2 on math benchmarks.
They also report surpassing both DeepSeek v3.2 and GPT-OSS-120B on the challenging APEX shortlist benchmark, again under that extended compute regime.
For listeners not following the open weight race closely, what does it mean to compete with a model like GPT-OSS-120B that has roughly 15 times the active parameters at inference?
It means intelligence per parameter, which Zyphra explicitly calls intelligence density, is climbing fast enough that small open models can punch into territory previously reserved exclusively for large frontier closed-source systems.
That has huge implications for the unit economics of inference at scale, because if you can match a 120 billion active parameter model with 760 million active, your cost per query collapses.
And the licensing matters just as much as the benchmarks here, because ZAYA1 is released under Apache 2.0 with weights freely available on Hugging Face, so any startup or enterprise can pick it up and run it.
Which raises the strategic question every listener is probably asking right now. Namely, what does this release actually mean for the broader AI ecosystem over the next 6 to 12 months as it ripples through?
Three things stand out to me here, and the first is that the AMD versus NVIDIA conversation is no longer purely theoretical, because it now has a real frontier reasoning model as a public proof point.
The second has to be the open weight reasoning race, because we keep seeing smaller labs ship models that punch way above their weight, and it is genuinely changing how enterprises evaluate vendors and procurement.
Exactly. And the third is that test time compute is becoming the new battleground, because architectures and weights are starting to commoditize. But how you spend inference compute is now where models really differentiate.
That last point feels really important to me because we used to think the model was the product, and now increasingly the inference policy and the reasoning loop are just as much the product itself.
It also means the bar for what counts as a frontier-capable open model is dropping an absolute parameter count, even as it rises in benchmark scores, which is a genuinely strange and exciting moment for builders.
Before we wrap, give me the one-liner for the founder or chief technology officer listening to us right now and trying to figure out what to actually do about this announcement on Monday morning.
I would say download the ZAYA1 weights, run them on whatever inference hardware you have available, and seriously evaluate Markovian RSA on your hardest internal reasoning benchmarks before you sign any new vendor contract.
And from a hardware procurement angle, this is the strongest argument yet for at least pricing AMD into your next compute build, because the software gap is clearly closing in measurable, public, reproducible ways now.
Couldn't agree more, and honestly, today's episode is a great reminder that the most interesting moves in AI right now are not always coming from the biggest labs with the loudest marketing teams in the industry.
One more thing worth flagging for our enterprise listeners is that an Apache 2 licensed open weight model dramatically simplifies your legal review compared to any closed source vendor agreement you would otherwise be negotiating right now.
Absolutely. And combined with running on AMD Silicon, you get a procurement story where both the model and the underlying compute are genuinely portable across clouds and on-premise environments without single vendor lock-in.
I think the bigger lesson here is that the AI stack is finally starting to behave like a real ecosystem, with multiple credible options at each layer, rather than a single tower running from the chip up.
That's exactly right. And for builders, that means the next 12 months are going to be about composing the best stack for your specific workload, rather than just defaulting to whoever has the loudest sales team.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.